So I just finished watching the Netflix documentary on Woodstock 99, and I think it's called Trainwreck, and it is an absolute mind trip. Now, first let's cut through of all the way throughout it. You have these retroactive or retrospective interviews of people now reflecting on the things that were happening back then, and there's a just absolute cloud of I am legally denying all responsibility of everything that happened. Like you can hear that in the background, as if like their lawyers previewed the interview script of the questions that these people were going to be asked, and that they went through and they like with a red pen marked out, you're not allowed to ask this, you're not allowed to ask this, reword that question to ensure that nobody would get entrapped into saying something that could legally implicate themselves for what happened. So there's that in the background. So if we can ignore that background noise, let's get into it. And there's a few specific things that just kind of stick in my mind about it. The first would be the matter of it falls immediately into the trap, or maybe it's even born out of, vomited out of the trap of the good old days, golden age of the past fallacy. The idea that Woodstock 69 happened, Jimi Hendrix, Star Spangled Banner, all that stuff happened in, at this point would have been 30 years prior, and all the people that were there, or that maybe they even had a great time, have grown up now. They're 30 years older, and they're wanting to provide a similar experience for today's youth, hoping that the similar values that culminated in Woodstock 69 will kind of remanifest themselves in this 90s era Y2K anxious millennial generation that now exists, right? And so you have peace and love generation, right? And so they're reflecting on that and they're wanting to bring it forward. And of course, that never works. If you've ever tried to, like, let's say you had a really great, let's say, honeymoon or a great vacation in the past, and so now you're going to try to go back to the same locations, maybe even in the same sequence, recreate the same photo ops to try and recreate that exact same experience again, you'll know it doesn't work like that. You're older now. Your knees are not as healthy as they once were, and your kids are not as compliant as they once were, or now you have kids when you didn't previously, and it goes off the rails fairly quickly. Maybe you're able to salvage it later, but probably not. Everyone ends up being less than enthused with the eventual outcome. That's how those go. And the same thing happens here. But in it, of course, you're having, in the first part of it is the build-up, the hype. Everyone's excited, right? Well, we also have to reflect on the acts list that they brought in, right? Limp Bizkit and Korn, Bush. They're not quite the same, right? And they obviously, like, they didn't equip the event sufficiently. That's something they talk about a lot. Not enough of bathrooming facilities. There's not enough distance between the latrines and the drinkable water, and there's contamination everywhere, and there wasn't enough shade. There wasn't enough of anything to support the amount of people that showed up. And they kind of make this vibe about it that maybe it's due to the fact that they underestimated how many people would be involved. It ended up being close to 300,000, I think, 250,000 people. That's a lot. That it would dwarf many ancient armies that would have been racked with things like dysentery and cholera during the Crusades or other major campaigns like that. Like the amount of people there dwarfed those things, and yet they were underserved, under-equipped, undermanned, right? They just all of that was happening. And makes you wonder, maybe it's because they oversold the tickets. I've heard of that happening at concerts and things. They oversold the tickets, and such, doing things that are just, where were you mind-wise when you made that decision, like handing out candles, giving flammable objects to people that already have a short fuse to begin with? Like, there's a lot of very huge mistakes that were made throughout it, and none of them, they all say, yeah, that was a mistake, but they also, like I said, the cloud of, but I'm legally not admitting to anything that can be criminally prosecuted in a court of law, right? But I wonder about the audience itself. That's the thing I want to talk about the most. The audience itself is fascinating to me, on account of the fact that literally a mud hole that is contaminated with human feces and no drinkable water and overcharging for everything. And they show the shots of the graffiti of end profit stock, right? And that they were dissatisfied with the customer service, you might say, in the vendor village, and that they didn't like those things. But it seems like nobody thought to themselves, this is bad, I should leave. Nobody seems to have maybe obviously they don't show anyone that leaves out of dissatisfaction with the overall atmosphere of the event. The contrast is actually, there's an interview right near the end where this woman appears to be one of the people they brought back for a retrospective interview, where she's talking about how the price gouging was out of control, they were just trying to profit off of us, human feces everywhere, people are getting broken bones and physical injuries that are substantial. And then the interview asks, but would you come back if they did it again? No hesitation. Oh yeah, this was great. That dichotomy is what blows my mind. And I think that there's something in that that's strange. Maybe it's just because I'm too old. In 1999, I would have been 10 years old at that time, so you can put together whatever you want about that. But think about, I was too young in the day, and now I'm too old to enjoy it now because I have like a wife and children and a mortgage, right? But I think about these things of like, she just rattled off all these reasons that this has been a terrible experience, and yet her summary of it is, when's the next one? And we can summarize a lot of human experiences that way, right? Every electoral campaign we bring up, it's all lies, right? The whole thing of some fairy tales start with when I am elected, all that we do this in that way too. We are just as, do we want to say hypocritical? Do we want to say delusional in that way about those sorts of things, right? And there are other places that we can insert this kind of strangeness, like that I think liberals would kind of dilute, or maybe condense is maybe the better terminology, of child rearing in that way, right? That pregnancy is, I'm going to lose my bikini body and it's going to get torn apart from the inside by this kid kicking my ribs from within and all this, and then going to give birth, and it's going to be all-nighters and screaming in the middle of the night and bottle feeding and human feces and vomit and just whatever that comes along with having a newborn. And then as soon as you get a kid that's able to kind of run and walk a little bit, be a little bit more autonomous, able to feed themselves a little bit, we're like, well, let's do that again. So this is an interesting thing about human behavior, depending on how you want to spin it, right? But there's more to it than that as well, of that as people are beginning to see the crowd just get riled up, violent. It talks about how the Korn concert, specifically, their set riled these people up, and there's anger in the crowd and things like that. And then with the Limp Bizkit set as well, that he's just like riling them up and riling them up and riling them up. And of course, one of the things about having a very emotionalized group of people, whether they're concentrated in one location or scattered across and connected only by the internet, one of the major things that you absolutely should not do is take away their leader, right? Give them a martyr rather than simply a leader. And that all that does is increase their level of radicalization as they begin to decentralize and begin to relax back into basic human emotional responses to things without that central leader. But the Limp Bizkit set is really fascinating too. He goes out there and the first thing he does is identify the enemy, right? Does anybody out here like Backstreet Boys, which they've been putting in cuts of how the MTV has been really heavily promoting the profit-driven musical acts like the Bubblegum Pop, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, and Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera stuff, right? And how that the fans of the people that were there currently were getting dissatisfied with MTV's drift away from that edgy, hard rock culture towards the money stuff, right? And that now, I mean, do they even play music videos at all anymore? It's all 16 and pregnant, right? Repo, whatever. Yeah? So, that he begins to identify an enemy and then begins to project into their emotions until eventually giving them an activation statement. Break stuff. And what do they immediately begin to do? Kick through the plywood barriers around the sound tower in the back of the crowd that's literally surrounded by angry, emotionalized, energetic, and intoxicated young adults. And as it gets more and more dangerous as a result, and then as soon as all that emotional energy gets whipped up into a froth, he leaves the stage. That's wild, right? And the thing that I was thinking about as I was watching that, and we had some other people here too that were watching it, the thing that I was thinking about is that's exactly like a Pentecostal revival. Identify the adversary, project into and play against, project onto the emotionality of a crowd organism, and then give that emotionally delusional or maybe just ecstatic collection of people an action statement. Come down to the front, raise your hands. Right? It's the same exact phenomena. And it's notable that in just classical Christian exorcist lore, going like even like thousands of years, something that has been recognized, or at least whatever you want to say, has been recognized about a supernatural event is the willingness to abide in filth, the consumption of intoxicant substance, and the actions of individuals being, or less, let's say the needs of individuals being sublimated to a crowd organism, essentially. And so let's talk about those three things present in this event. First of all, like I said, that there was like just mud everywhere, contaminated water, nobody is safe. They're drinking feces, contaminated water, and they are literally bathing in baptizing themselves in this mud hole, essentially, that had runoff from the porta potty in it, gleefully, happily doing so. And in those moments, like, knowing that that stuff was just infested with human bacteria, nobody thought, I need out of here. I need to get out of here, right? The next thing would be that intoxicant substance. It starts about all 3 episodes of this mini-series feature people just marijuana, who knows whatever else, ecstasy and things that are just through everywhere. People are just holding up bags and telling them, I've got this, and telling them how much they wanted to sell it for. Nobody was stopping them. Nobody was policing it in any way. And that as the night would go on, the more that these things would perfuse. That even they would show shots of just plastic bottles flying around that actually looked like insects infesting, like a dump type thing flying through the air like that. Or like the infestation of large graining insects on a field, or it just visually it looked exactly the same. And then the next thing would have been that everyone's acting as a crowd as opposed to highlighting the individual needs and caring for them. That one of the things that's inherently Christian, more so than anywhere in any other religious system, is the need to care for the least of these and the fringe groups. And people will disagree with me about that, but that's because they just don't know Christian history. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Seneca, other Roman historians, in official documents even presented to the Roman Senate, used to say that one of the major reasons why Christianity is growing the way that it did in the first few centuries of the Roman Empire, was that they were attractive to the slaves and women and children on the basis of their core values of caring for slaves, women, and children in a way that the Roman culture certainly did not, and that most cultures that they interact with, that Christians would interact with, didn't either. It drew all sorts of underrepresented people in society. So that's Christian. But here in this society, that it's just these mass or organic group of individuals that are just acting out of control and without supervision. But let's talk about some of the subtextual, or let's say maybe consequential effects of what exorcists for 1,000 years have regarded as being implicit of spiritual and even demonic activity. Greed, sexual depravity, and violence towards women, specifically. But also children. There wasn't really, in that, here you have, just gouging price, $12 for a plastic bottle of water. That's out of control. But of course, as the demonic influence, it seems, got stronger and stronger on the event each passing day, there was nothing to prevent it. And then they even began to refer to it as what? Profit stock. They're just trying to profit off of us. As if, like, what do you think they were trying to do, having a massive music festival in the 90s? What did you think it was going to be? Them profiting off you, obviously. The reason there's a big white circle with a white dot in the center on the corner of most cities here in America is that there's a group of people that want to profit off of you. A blue square with a white W in the center of it. Or just any of these brand corporate associations. They want to profit off of you. Whatever you perceive your need to be, they want to provide it so that they can relieve you of your financial assets and then use that in their own way, whatever that happens to be. So in some ways, people coming in a deluded manner, believing things about the event that were obviously never going to come true. But greed was just rampant throughout the event, and not just amongst like the large, faceless organisms that were present there, but also individually, talking about how that they were gouging the crowd goers, like the actual audience members, gouging each other on the prices for intoxicant substances and even the security, misrepresenting themselves so they could sell their access to the backstage and just all that sort of stuff. Greed, rampant throughout it, right? And that we can see that traced throughout human history of the last 2 millennia. That as greed infested certain organizations, including Christian organizations, that the demonic began to exploit and even destroy those things from within. The next thing would be that sexual depravity, that you have people just engaging in all sorts of illicit and even criminal sexual activities throughout the event, that even though it wasn't for people who are underage, of course there was still people, maybe fake IDs, however it is that they got in, maybe they weren't carded at all, it doesn't matter, that they were there and that they were being molested, sexually assaulted, undoubtedly. At the end, they're talking about that police were investigating just a few specific instances that they thought they could prosecute, but I would be shocked if there was less than 1,000 sexual assaults throughout that event. I'd be less than, if there was less than 10,000, with 250,000 people, no supervision, no physical restrictions to keep anything from happening to anyone. Of course there was far more going on there, that people walking around unclothed and so forth. Like, it would be amazing, like, if from the way that they were even discussing it, like, it wasn't any worse than anywhere else of that size and stuff like that, like, as if it's, like, it should have been expected. And in a rational way, like a sterilized, rational way, you kind of wonder, like, maybe. So, sexual depravity, disregarding physical safety, and then also preying on the least of these, the most vulnerable. Talking about crowds of guys getting around and trying to pressure women into revealing their sexual organs and like all this stuff of, like, that is trademark demonic influence. Trademark. And to which someone might try to come at me with, well, what about Jim Baker? What about Jimmy Swagger? What about, and I would say, yeah, exactly, demonic. That it's not necessarily that this person was demon possessed, but that they were under the influence of demonic spiritual forces. And that you see these things that over time, it just increases and increases, that the promoters and that the organizers of the event were saying that we've lost control of this thing. There's something else at play here that is bigger than us, that we have no ability to control. That's what they were saying. That's, in a lot of ways, almost verbatim to what they were saying, and that they even intentionally used pagan spiritual language throughout the thing, knowingly or unknowingly. That saying that they had Willie Nelson scheduled specifically to be like a spiritual experience for everyone on Sunday. Why? Because Sunday morning is when everyone goes to church, right? And that there was, and I've heard this tons of times, right? That people that engage in criminal behavior say that if they want to try to do it in a way where there's less likelihood that they'll encounter people, like, getting in their way, interfering with their business, that they'll do it on Sunday morning between 8 and 12, because that's when the people go to church. People that have a moral reprehension against my behavior are going to be out of the way, right? And that, and so forth. And so there's that, they use all kinds of pagan language during the night raves and so forth, saying that these things are inherently sexual, or that they appear to be sexual or supernatural and so forth, like that they knew what was happening, even if they didn't have necessarily the momentary language to describe it in that specific moment. Clearly it was supernatural, and that, like I said, doesn't necessarily mean they were demonically possessed, although there are certain people that I could point out that I think maybe they are. That person individually is. Demonic influence and oppression, or on an event, is different, or on an individual is different, and that there's not a mistake that throughout human history over the last couple of millennia, they referred to things like alcohol as spirits, because even amongst non-Christian sources, the idea of alcohol of various kinds and various inhaled toxic substances and things have been in concert with supernatural influences. That you take this substance or these herbs or these whatever it is, and then that's what kind of initiates you into your spirit journey, or your spirit walk, or that's how you begin the process inside of a sweat lodge and various things like that. That those things have gone hand in hand for thousands of years because it works. That people will say like that I, as a Christian, am an atheist in regards to all these other spiritual beings that have been venerated throughout human history. And that's not true. Christians recognize the existence of other spiritual entities, and so does the Bible. It doesn't deny the existence of things like Dagon or Baal or Ashtoreth. It doesn't deny their existence. It denies their worthiness of praise and their ability to rule over God's people, or their right to rule over God's people. That's what it denies. And so that they're not equal with the God of Israel, the God of Christ, the God of Christianity, Yahweh, Jesus. Like that, they're not equal, and that's one of the things that separates like Mormonism from Christianity, and Jehovah's Witnesses from Christianity, even though they claim association, that they believe Jesus, God, that those are attainable states that humans can ascribe to, and that other spiritual beings are equal in, or that are parallel and different things like that, and it's not true. Christians believe that all these things exist. These are supernatural entities that do have power and do have various kinds of authority, but there's only one that has all authority, that has all power and rules over even those things. And that's kind of the point of Job in the first few chapters of that book, is the idea that there's a divine courtroom, essentially, throne room, that all these things have to bow the knee towards, and there's only one sitting on the throne of it, and that those things have to ask that God on the throne for permission to act before they are able to. And sometimes they often are in rebellion against him, they're still only able to act in such ways that God permits them, that he holds their leash and restricts them as he will, and loosens them as he will, to do that which is in concert with his will. And so I wonder, in the aftermath of this, like obviously there's a lot of people that were dissatisfied with their variable experiences, but I wonder, like, how many women were actually physically assaulted during that weekend, sexually assaulted during that weekend, forced to do things against their will during that weekend? How many that were legally adolescents, that were children, that were forced to do things that they weren't ready for, and never, in many ways, would never be ready for? How many children were born illegitimately after the fact? How many people now have massive therapy bills to deal with the mental, emotional, and psychological trauma that they went through during that? Because I'd be willing to bet that that one moment dwarfs religious trauma by a significant measure. How many people afterwards can't even listen to Limp Bizkit, to Korn, to Bush on the radio without having PTSD-esque flashbacks to that? How many? And asking again, was it worth it? Was it worthwhile? Because what's awkward for me to deal with in terms of, despite all of that, how many would still say it was worth it?